So it's wonderful to be here, and thanks so much to SERC for organizing this day and for the funding of this project. I'm here representing Josh Tenenbaum and myself in this collaborative work we have done together. So we'll start off by pointing out an interesting observation about moral cognition, that one of the most striking features of the human moral mind is its flexibility. We can make judgments about moral cases that we've never seen before. Is it morally permissible, for instance, to get a haircut during a global pandemic? Before a couple of years ago, none of us had ever thought about that issue before. And there doesn't need to be a global pandemic in order for the moral landscape to change. There are new technologies all the time, new information, and new opportunities. And we need to make decisions about how it's morally acceptable to act in light of these changes. So what we do in our line of work is we work at the intersection of cognitive science and AI safety. Thinking about the ways that the human mind works, trying to understand that with a certain kind of computational precision in order to see if we can inform AI safety, how AI systems can navigate the human moral and social world in a way that's morally acceptable and safe. And the kind of ideal vision of this program is that there should be a dynamic exchange between these two fields. That as we learn things about human moral cognition, that'll help make AI systems safer. And then as we attempt to build those things into AI systems, we'll discover we actually don't understand moral cognition as well as we thought to originally. So this works in a kind of virtuous cycle as this research program progresses. What I'm going to do today is talk to you mostly about the cognitive science work that we did, writing down in computational terms how the human moral mind works. And then what I want to do is sketch also how we think that what we've learned about moral cognition could be an important alignment target for AI safety quite broadly. Okay, so how does moral judgment work? One thing seems obvious just from a simple glance at our moral world. Rules seem to be important. The moral world seems to be guided by these inviolable rules often. We use rules to communicate moral expectations to one another. We use them to teach our children how to act in social situations. There are rules about the way we treat our experimental subjects, what counts as honesty in academic work, how we're supposed to navigate complex relationships in the workplace. There are rules everywhere, and they often seem to be written in stone. And in fact, sometimes they literally are written in stone. So why do rules play such an important part of our moral lives and our theories of morality? Well, there are many reasons, but one of the most important reasons is that they're efficient. Our human minds are limited in various important ways, and rules are simple ways to articulate kind of complex ideas. So despite the fact that rules seem like they have this rigidity to them, there are also constant exceptions. So for instance, it seems like there's one very simple rule about stealing: don't steal. But on the other hand, we also know that it's okay to jump into a cafe and steal a napkin if you really need one, yet we also know that you can't just take the whole stack to refill your supply at home. So it seems like actually when we dig a little deeper, we realize that we have this kind of complex and subtle idea about what the rule is, when it applies, and when it doesn't apply. This is a lovely example of this sort of thing. So this is the kitchen from building 46 right across the hall down the street from my old office when I was a postdoc. And if you zoom in here, you see that someone has written on this bottle of soap, "Do not steal." So the question arises, don't MIT graduate students know that it's wrong not to steal? And certainly they do. So what was this attempting to communicate? It seems like somebody thought that the act of taking this soap did not count as stealing. So we have a vigilante soap idea corrector who is trying to tell you that because of the background conditions here, this actually does count as a case of stealing. So the point here is that we often have a fine-grained idea about what rules are, but we can sometimes go wrong with our use of rule flexibility. Okay, So there's lots of mysteries about rules. Where do they come from? What do we do when there are no rules? How do we make new ones? And how do we know when the rules apply and they don't apply? Rules are flexible. And so we need theories in order to understand where and how this flexibility arises. So moral psychology has typically used theories of moral philosophy in order to get off the ground, in order to make models about how the human mind works. And traditionally, in moral psychology, we've relied on two main theories of moral philosophy, deontology and consequentialism. Though in our work, a central driving theory is these ideas from contractualism. And so what we're attempting to do is show that all of these theories from moral philosophy can be combined into a triple theory of morality, which explains not only where rules come from, but how they are flexible and how they can be applied in this flexible way. So what that amounts to is pointing out that the function of morality is essentially to help us all get along. And that is the core idea behind contractualism, that we can understand what morality demands of us by thinking about what everybody would agree to. We can do this rational negotiation for mutual benefit. But the trouble is, that is often extremely difficult for the moral situations that we find ourselves involved in. We lack the time, information, and processing power in order to run this full negotiation that we would need to figure out how to reach mutual benefit, the contractualist ideal. So instead, we do a sort of resource rational approximation of that ideal. And what our theory proposes is that the rest of the moral mechanisms of cognition, things like using rules, calculating outcomes, the things that might come to mind when you think about how we make moral decisions, what we argue is that all of those mechanisms are simply approximations of this contractualist ideal. So what we've been doing over the past year is actually developing this theory and then positing that this theory of how human moral cognition works should act as a way of aligning AI systems. So I'll tell you more about the specific ways that we're studying that in a minute, but the broad idea I want you to take from this is to understand that humans have these limitations, which is why we use rules and other mechanisms in order to figure out how to act in moral situations. AI systems also have resource limitations. They also have the limitations of time, information, and processing power. So if that's the case, we can use human cognition as an inspiration for how to have AI systems navigate the human moral world as well. Okay, so how exactly do we study this in humans? So I'll tell you about a couple of very specific experiments that we ran so you get a sense of how this sort of research goes. So we'll start off with this question: how do we figure out when the rules apply and when they don't? And this is work with Josh and my awesome collaborators also in the computational cognitive science lab. Okay, so we'll start off with what again seems like a fairly simple rule, the rule about waiting in line. So it seems like there's one very simple rule about waiting in line: just get in the back of the line and wait your turn, right? So the way that we're going to be studying this is in this like game environment. And what the goal of the people in this game is to collect water from various water sources and to deposit it in those buckets as quickly as they can. So this is what happens when things go well. People just pick up water from the buckets, and they just kind of walk in this very orderly fashion all the way to the buckets, depositing the water. Okay. And sometimes one person will get out of line, and they'll go directly towards the water source, get the water, and deposit it in the buckets. So it seems like, on the face of things, what went wrong here is that this person broke the rule, right? There was a rule about standing in line. This person got in front of the line without waiting their turn. But if that's the case, then we have trouble explaining this particular situation. So in this situation, everybody is again waiting in line, and we see one person get out of line and go directly towards the water source. But in this case, while the person in some sense, broke the rule. In another sense, we feel relieved that they actually figured that out. After all, it seems like what they did benefits everybody, including themselves, and it's not clear why those people were standing in line to begin with. So what we want is ultimately a theory that can explain the subtle ways that we understand when breaking this rule is a problem and when ultimately it's morally permissible. So we propose a particular model of how to go about thinking about this. And it's an approach that we've been studying for a number of years now called universalization. Ultimately, we think about this as a sort of contractualist heuristic approximation to an agreement-based ideal, though you might have also heard of this if you've read any Kant. So this is like a kind of Kantian model. And so the thought is that when a person looks at this person who's getting out of line, they think, what would happen if everybody in this situation felt at liberty to get out of line? What would that do in this universalized world? And what they can essentially figure out is, well, everybody would kind of be able to find their way to the water, and things would actually go quite smoothly. This would actually be a good world to live in, a world where everybody broke the rule in a case like this. But if you contrast that to thinking about what would happen if everybody felt at liberty to get out of line in this case, you realize you get a lot of chaotic crashing. And that's just simply a bad thing to do. So what we propose is that people simulate this sort of universalization reasoning to figure out what would happen if somebody broke the rule in this case. So what we do as an experiment is we develop a whole series of different maps that manipulate various spatiotemporal features of this sort of world. And we ask subjects, how morally permissible was it to do that thing that that person did, which is always a case of getting out of line. And what we can then do is model what exactly would the world be like if everybody gets out of line. So we have this kind of agent-based simulation where each of these people pretends that no rule exists and just plans directly towards the water source. And you can see, just as we anticipated, everything goes quite smoothly in this case, and things go badly in other cases. So then what we can ultimately do is build a model that includes this universalizability feature, as well as various other features that you might think matter for whether or not breaking this rule is acceptable. And ultimately, we find that this is a good way of understanding how people are making judgments in cases like this. OK, so here's one way that it seems like people figure out how to break rules. They think about what would happen in this quite sophisticated way if everybody broke the rule in that case. OK. So I'll just tell you a couple of more directions that we're taking with this project. One is to think about exactly what people mean when they communicate simple rules. So for example, think about a park where you might see a sign that says, "Don't walk on the grass." And if you're trying to figure out what that rule means, similar to the case of don't stand in line, what does that rule mean? You might think it just means something like, all policies that include steps on the grass are prohibited. But in fact, as you'll see, there are lots of cases where actually it might be OK to break the rule. So while this path might be one that is perfectly acceptable, also this path might be one that's perfectly acceptable, this being a hospital, for instance. On the other hand, this might not be acceptable for somebody to cut across the grass, specifically to go to a coffee shop. And this might not be acceptable either. This person is headed to the hospital, but it seems like maybe they actually don't need to get there that quickly. What if the person has a pogo stick and takes this path to get to the hospital? Well, they're not walking on the grass, but it seems obvious that that shouldn't be permitted either. What if your dog has run onto the grass and what you're doing is running over there to try to stop them from digging a hole in the grass? What if you're a gardener and you take this path across the grass? So all of these examples are simply to get you to realize that when we communicate a simple rule, like don't walk on the grass, you can actually recover much more communicative meaning than is simply articulated. So one of the things that we're positing this rule actually means is something like, okay, there was somebody who simulated a bargain of everybody in the community who brought their needs to the table. And what they all decided together is that, sure, each of us individually would benefit if we managed to cut across the grass to get wherever we were going a little bit quicker. But if that were to happen, then we would all lose the grass. The grass would die, and that would yield this collective harm that is more important than the benefit we would each individually derive. And so what we're arguing is all of that can be understood by simply reading this sign, "Don't walk across the grass." And then what you can do is use that simulated model to then go and predict in these kinds of edge cases or unusual cases whether or not it's actually permitted for you to walk across the grass in this case, given your simulation of what everybody would agree to if they could talk about it. So I'm not going to go into the specific ways we test that and the models we build and the data we collect, but that's one of the kind of things that we're thinking about right now. Okay. There's another couple of really exciting directions here, which I'll just touch on very briefly. You'll notice that all of the studies that I've talked about up until now are done with in a very kind of Western context. So our subjects are people who live in the United States, probably think a lot like I think. But what we want to do here, especially if we're trying to use this model of moral cognition as a guide for AI alignment, is to ensure that what we're studying is something that's true of the human mind and not just true of these particular participants that we happen to talk to. So we have an awesome collaboration going with Nori Jacobi at Cornell, who has this pipeline where he can translate a set of stimuli into 80 different languages and run it in 60 different countries. So that's what we're getting started on now. We're using this paradigm of water gathering. And when you kind of run a study like this cross-culturally, you need to really understand that everybody understands everything that's going on in the scenario. So there's a ton of checks to make sure that that happens. We translate the instructions into lots of different languages. And we have various hypotheses about the types of things that we might see depending on how much people are using the types of rule-breaking mechanisms that we've introduced. So we have a set of pilot data that's really exciting, just in a handful of languages. But one of the main thing that we used the SERC funding for was to fund an awesome student who got this started, who has since moved on to working on AI policy in Washington. So that's an awesome opportunity for him, but we need help with this project. So we're currently hiring somebody who wants to kind of take up the mantle of this cross-cultural work. So if that might be you or somebody you know, definitely feel free to get in touch. This is an extremely exciting project that's going to have, I think, a big impact. Okay, and yeah, with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you. Questions for Sydney?
The first question that I have is that rule have a genetic component to it? Like there's some rule that can be inherited. So that will be a question that I have.
Yeah, do rules have a genetic component, you ask? Right. Yeah, interesting question. Really interesting question. Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is one of the most foundational questions of cognitive science, which parts of this sort of moral cognition are kind of embedded in our minds, in the architecture of our minds, and which are learned socially. And that's one of the things that we aim to test with this cross-cultural study. Are we going to see broad patterns that look similar across cultures, or do some cultures just do a very different thing? Though the particular way you phrased your question was, are rules embedded in the mind? And that'll depend a bit on what you mean by a rule. So the thing that we hope to find cross-culturally is this mechanism of interpreting rules, which is something like universalization or a certain kind of like bargaining simulation. Though what I imagine we might find is that those mechanisms are used to apply to very different rules that are designed in different cultures based on the context that they emerge from. So I wouldn't be surprised if we find rule similarity, but simply because environments are similar in lots of places. But what I hope to find cross-culturally is the same mechanism of rule interpretation, potentially. I don't know, this is an empirical question, yeah.
Hi, thanks. I wondered if there's a sort of temporal component to add to this. So when do you jaywalk or something? So it isn't just your assessment now, but it's like the rules are set to sort of be absolute. And yet people are making judgments about under certain circumstances I'll jaywalk, under other circumstances I won't, and how you sort of fit that part in.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think like one of the critical questions is to figure out what counts as a morally relevant feature. So when you say like time might matter, you probably don't mean is it like 12 o'clock or 12:01, or is it Tuesday or Thursday? Unless for some reason that picks out something important. Maybe the traffic laws are one way on Tuesday and a different law on Thursday. So what matters is figuring out what is a morally relevant feature of the context, how do you represent that feature, and how do you then compute over it in order to get the right answer. Did I get your question? Did I understand?
Yes.
Yeah.
There might be more to thinking about the temporal, setting the rules, and then what people feel they're obligated to do.
Aha. Okay, interesting.
Just a snapshot that is the situation, make your judgment, because I
Oh, okay, yes, okay. So, yeah. Okay, yeah, so that's like pretty critical to what we're thinking about. So, yeah, okay, so when rules are codified, they tend to, like rule makers tend to have particular circumstances in mind. So for instance, like somebody who's putting up a sign that says no walking on the grass, they might do that when they know certain things about the community, certain things about the health of the grass and the sustainability of the grass and what the weather is likely to be, et cetera. But if those things change, then the applicability of the rule might change. And as a person comes along, reads the rule, and understands the context and the circumstances, they might realize the rule didn't anticipate my circumstance. And so I need to then figure out what was the rule trying to communicate and what should I do in this case given my update about the context and the relevant information. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Awesome. Well, I'm afraid, with apologies to the remaining questioners, we have to move on. That's fascinating stuff, and maybe you'll get an opportunity to ask Sydney the questions sort of offline. Sorry about that. Great, thank you.